Hello, my name is Reverend Dr. May Elise Cannon. Today is Tuesday, July 2nd, and today is day 270 since October 7th. I have a lot to share today. A lot of it's not easy news to share. This morning, 31 people were killed in Israeli airstrikes. That was on Tuesday morning, according to the health ministry in Gaza. 6 minutes ago, the New York Times posted an article entitled "The Evacuation Order That Brings New Chaos to Southeastern Gaza." I think I shared this yesterday, that I woke up in the morning to news from some of the development agencies saying that there were evacuation orders in Khan Yunis in South Gaza. And one of the strategies of the Israeli military right now are targeted attacks or raids. And so people are being displaced from very small locations time and time again. And so we're hearing reports of just chaos and craziness in terms of people relocating and having to pack up tents and having to repurchase things because once they settle, they can't pick them up and move them again. As of a few weeks ago, it was believed the number of hostages that remained alive in the Gaza enclave was to be less than 50 people, perhaps. And the question is, how many of those hostages remain alive today? And the death toll of Palestinians continues to climb. Crowds of Palestinians were fleeing a swath of southeastern Gaza after Israel issued a warning to evacuate large parts of the city of Khan Yunis and Rafah while striking several targets in South Gaza overnight. The evacuations order on Monday and a heavy night of airstrikes came despite recent statements from Israeli commanders and Prime Minister Netanyahu promising to wind down major ground operations and to shift to lower intensity stages of targeted raids. So we're hearing things and then we're seeing different things, which has been quite consistent over the last 270 days. The New York Times broke a story saying that Israeli generals low on munitions want a truce in Gaza. Israel's military leadership wants a ceasefire in case a larger war with Hezbollah breaks out. That's according to security officials. They're saying this is also the swiftest way to release any remaining hostages. There are apparently 120 hostages, dead and alive, still held in Gaza. And this is according to interviews with 6 current and former security officers. They're saying that the army is under-equipped for further fighting. This is the longest war in decades. The generals think their forces need time to recuperate. I think I mentioned when I was in Israel, there were significant concerns about post-traumatic stress for the Israeli army. A lot of these soldiers are very young. This, of course, is not taking into account the toll on the civilians and the people in Gaza. But the Lebanese militia that has been locked in a low level of fighting with Israel since October is one of the most significant reasons. A truce with Hamas can make it easier to reach a deal with Hezbollah, according to officials. Hamas, just a note, we've been talking about this quite a bit, has been open to a permanent ceasefire agreement and release of the hostages as long as there are guarantees that the fighting and the bombing of Gaza would be brought to an end. But the generals, there is an assumption, and some analysts have said the generals don't necessarily have the political cachet at this point with Netanyahu to guarantee any type of political agreement. So no progress yet, specifically in that regard. Palestinian fighters in the West Bank seem to emulate Hamas in Gaza, was another New York Times article. In the towns of Tulkarm and Jenin, our militants are flocking to more hardline factions, such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad, while the Israeli military tries to rein them in. And this is what we've been saying all along. If there are not prospects for peace, if there is no nonviolent way forward, why are people surprised? If desperate people take desperate measures, if peace is not possible after months and months and decades of occupation, violence and extremism, many people feel is the only option. So this should not be a surprise to anyone that the longer this goes on, the bombing of Gaza, the death tolls rise, that there will be a rise in extremism. Anyway, that's being reported. A UN official says 80% of Gaza's population has been displaced. In other news, a top UN official said on Tuesday that 1.9 million people have been displaced, or about 80% of the pre-war population in the densely populated Strip. Israel has established a new power line to supply electricity to a desalination plant in Khan Yunis, allowing the possibility of providing 2,000 cubic meters of drinking water per day, according to the Israeli military. It would be paid for by the Palestinian Authority, and UNICEF, a UN agency, would manage the plant. It'll be interesting to see how that happens. The PA, as you know, has not been able to pay its own workers in Ramallah. They've been at like less than 50% of their staff salaries, but that was announced today. The Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said that his country's forces were advancing towards the final stages of eliminating Hamas's terrorist army. That's a quote. Though he added that Israel would still have to continue to strike its remnants. Netanyahu's comments were made to cadets at the Israel National Defense College, where the latest sign that his government intends to wind down major military operations and shift the focus on the northern border and what's happening with Hezbollah. So we've been hearing that things are going to wind down in Gaza. We heard that, and then we saw that the death toll, the attacks the last few days, the further displacements, what we're seeing and what we're hearing are not in alignment. I will say this, there was a report in Haaretz where an Israeli Defense Force chief of staff said this is a long battle, and when we get to the next stage, we'll use different methods. So the IDF's saying something different than Netanyahu. He's saying, he said at the logistics center near Rafah in South Gaza, the IDF chief of staff said that the battle in the city is an effort to destroy Hamas's infrastructure and underground infrastructure, and this will take time. That's why it's a long battle. Totally different than what we're hearing from the Prime Minister of Israel. The third mention about the phase, the news very soon, the Israeli Defense Forces will move into a third phase of the war in Gaza, where they would withdraw most of their forces from the Gaza Strip. So this has been reported by Haaretz, saying that the Israeli forces would withdraw from Gaza and that this is worrying Gaza residents because it would create a vacuum of authority. And the concern is, there's so much unrest. If Hamas has been displaced or defeated in part or in whole, if Hamas is not allowed to be an authority, if the Israeli army leaves, what's left? There is a complete vacuum. There are incredibly limited resources. What would then happen? That you would have complete chaos. And this is where we're talking about if there are not alternative authority, local authority that's established, desperate people take desperate measures. And so there's significant concerns of civil unrest. The Israeli military said 7 projectiles were launched from Lebanon. Hostilities have continued at the northern border and the border with South Lebanon. 8 teams have been trying to put out flames for at least 2 hours in northern Israel today that broke out following Lebanon rocket launches. Secretary Blinken said this week that Israel has effectively lost its sovereignty in its north because Hezbollah attacks have displaced so many people and the population there, underscoring the stakes of the cross-border attacks that have threatened to ignite a larger regional war. By that argument, you would have to say that Lebanon has also lost its sovereignty in South Lebanon because there are as many people displaced in South Lebanon because of Israel's attacks on the Lebanese border. I have not heard Secretary Blinken make that argument. Hezbollah's deputy leader says no ceasefire between Israel and Lebanon without an end to the war in Gaza. The deputy leader of the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah said Tuesday that the only sure path to a ceasefire is a full ceasefire in Gaza. Speaking of Blinken, in Washington, D.C., Freedom House, which is one of the most renowned NGOs focused on political rights and civil liberties, that's according to Haaretz, urged U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken to conduct ongoing, thorough, and transparent public assessments of whether Israel's usage of U.S. military assistance in Gaza abides by international humanitarian law ahead of Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington. You'll recall he is set to speak before the joint session of Congress on July 24th. We're calling for Solidarity Sunday. Please, please, please have your churches pray for peace, call for an end to the war on Gaza on Sunday, the 21st. Things are going crazy in the West Bank. Security officials have said that 50 masked settlers were throwing stones at Palestinians at a West Bank junction at a gas station. According to sources, 3 Palestinians were lightly wounded. The IDF said that it targeted a cell in a West Bank drone strike. 4 people were killed for the 3rd time in many days as Israeli military drones launched attacks on militants in Tulkarem in the West Bank, according to a statement that was issued tonight in Israel. According to the IDF, the attack targeted what they've identified as a terror cell. It was implanting incendiary devices near the Nur Shams refugee camp. The Palestinian Health Ministry has said 4 people were killed in a strike. That's perhaps the same strike that I just mentioned. The IDF has said that 3 Palestinians were arrested on suspicion of planning a shooting attack. That was an improvised Carlo machine gun. According to the IDF, the arrests were made after the military received intelligence information about the planning attack. In the United States, there was an anti-Semitic attack reported in Ohio where the FBI and police in Cincinnati are investigating the damaging of 180 gravestones at 2 Jewish cemeteries. The tombstones date back to the late 1800s, and they were knocked down between June 25th and earlier this week, according to the Jewish Federation of Cincinnati. In Israel, the Israeli government's attorney general and the state prosecutor's office are examining whether or not to charge Ben-Gvir, he's one of the more right-wing militant members of Netanyahu's government, during the war with incitement against the residents of Gaza. The state prosecutor is leaning towards recommending opening an investigation against Ben-Gvir and other senior officials for incitement. You'll note that incitement is a charge that's often brought against the Palestinian Authority. So this is incredibly, at least to my knowledge, unusual. On Monday in Tel Aviv, there was a gathering, a large rally that was organized. It's time, it's called the Great Peace Conference. It's time to give peace a chance. The rally was organized by a confederation of 50 organizations and individuals from Israel's left and pro-peace camp, with a message that revolved around the arena's LED screens, saying it's time to reach a deal, stop the war, make peace. The PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA, voted to divest from Israel bonds on Monday. The denomination passed a resolution denouncing Christian Zionism. Also, this was reported by Religious News Service. The General Assembly of the PCUSA voted on July 1st. Two companies, they're also starting conversations to encourage conversations because they believe these companies are contributing to human rights abuses of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. They're encouraging them to quit their practices. This includes General Electric and Palantir Technologies. They believe GE sells fighter jet engines that are used by the Israeli Air Force, and that Palantir Technologies provides Israel with artificial intelligence technologies that allow Israel to surveil Palestinians. The PCUSA has about 8,800 churches and 1 million members. And I wanted to close with these words from Reverend Alex Awad. He's a Palestinian Christian. I used to attend his church when I lived in Jerusalem, and I teased him that I always had to show up late because if I showed up early, he would put me to work. I think one time he even had me preach, but he was my pastor. Palestinian Christian Alex Awad said this: "This is a moment in history of humanity when people of faith and good conscience are called to revolt against injustice, oppression, and genocide. This is a moment in history when politicians must leave their political ambitions and interests behind them and rise to do what is just, good, and right. The suffering of my people, the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, has been going on for far too long. America, the country that has been for decades lecturing the nations of the world on human rights, freedom for all, and justice for all, is now called upon to end its collaboration with the state of Israel in executing this one-sided war and genocide against the civilians of Gaza. I call on all members of Congress to seize this moment and to rise to end the genocide." Reverend Alex Awad, a Palestinian Christian. May it be so. In the name of Christ. Amen.